Girls as young as 7 are being forced into arranged marriages, with some families claiming they're unaware it's illegal in Australia.
A 16-year-old left the home after being forced to marry, triggering an investigation into her 3 sisters being forced to marry, aged 10, 9 and 7.
Police have received more and more reports of forced marriage.
Professor Byrne says she recently dealt with one girl who was just 11 years old when she became engaged to her older cousin.
Already, Australia has seen one case of a 12-year-old girl being forced into a marriage to a man more than twice her age.
This is the devastating reality faced by countless girls all over Australia, and it's been happening for decades. 5 years ago, a young Iraqi woman living in Australia named Sarah came forward to share her story of exactly this situation. When she was only 14 years old, she was forced into a marriage to a much older man against her will. Just 2 years later, when Sarah was 16, she gave birth to her first child in a public Australian hospital. But despite being a child herself, no one raised the alarm or even batted an eye at the time. And unfortunately, Sarah's story is not an isolated one. But for most Australians, they don't even realise that this is happening. Finally, in 2013, Australia outlawed forced marriages under the criminal code. But sadly, that legislation meant nothing for women like Rukia Hidari. After being forced into a second arranged marriage to a much older man by her mother, Rukia was brutally murdered in 2020 by her husband. Rukia was just 15 years old when her mother forced her into her first marriage, again to a much older man. Tragically, Rukia's mother, Sakina Muhammad Jan, was also forced into a marriage when she was only 12 years old. She had her first child a year later when she was 13. When Rukia's first marriage ended in divorce, she was branded as Biwa by the Hazara community. Basically, this meant that she was seen to have lost her value and was viewed as dishonorable. To Rukia's mother, who was her only living parent, this meant that she had brought shame and dishonor on the family name. So to restore the family's reputation, Sakina arranged a second arranged marriage, again to a much older man. His name was Muhammad Ali Halimi. Just 6 weeks after their wedding, Muhammad slit Rukia's throat with a kitchen knife. Before their wedding, Rukia had disclosed to teachers, social workers, and even her driving instructor that she did not want to marry Muhammad and was being forced against her will. She told friends that she wanted to marry for love. But even though police had tried to offer assistance to Rukia in 2019, she was stuck between wanting to please her mother and wanting to pursue her own freedom, a decision that no child or young woman should ever be forced to contemplate. Muhammad was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. And just a few days ago, for the first time in Australia's history, Sakina was found guilty of forcing Rukia into the marriage against her will. If she's sentenced to more than 12 months in prison, she'll be deported back to Afghanistan. A couple of days ago, 3 men from Western Australia were also charged with forcing someone into an arranged marriage. But this time, the marriage was between 2 minors. So why does this keep happening in Australian society? Why aren't police being alerted to these things much further in advance? Well, for the Muslim community, there's a legal loophole. Whether they sign legal paperwork or not doesn't really matter to the community. It's the nikah that matters. And there's no obligation for these ceremonies to be disclosed to any authorities, as far as I understand. So in the case of these teenagers, their family members would only allow them to see each other if they agreed to marry in a nikah. Unfortunately, this is a very common practice within the Muslim community, especially for young people who just want to date and get to know one another. I'll admit, even I considered having a nikah as a teenager. That was the only way that my Muslim family would ever accept me dating a boy. There was no way I could introduce a boyfriend to them without also agreeing that I would marry him. That's why most of my cousins in Australia were all married by the time they were 18. Most of them had multiple kids by the time they were 20. I think Sakina's sentencing sends a really strong and well overdue message to the community that you are not going to get away with this in this country. But at the same time, I feel frustrated because I feel like the AFP is trying to frame this issue as something that isn't prominent within the Muslim community. In their official media release, they make a point of emphasizing that forced marriage isn't unique to a certain religion or culture. And yes, of course I agree with that. Anyone can be a victim of forced marriage, whether they're Muslim or not. But let's not sit here and pretend that this doesn't predominantly take place within the Muslim community specifically. I mean, we have documented cases of a 12-year-old being forced to marry a 27-year-old. We have the case of Essie and Aaliyah, who was forced to marry a much older man here in Australia when she was 14. That same man then threatened to marry off their 6-year-old daughter. By 2019, we had 171 cases of forced marriage being investigated by the AFP. But I have no doubt that that figure is just the tip of the iceberg. So when Muslim and ex-Muslim women speak up about the horrors we experience at the hands of our families and communities, do not shut us down and label us Islamophobic. Hear us when we tell you that these issues are thriving in our communities. And if you refuse to acknowledge this blatant and undeniable fact, you are placing so many girls and women in Australia at risk of the exact same devastating fate that Ruqyah faced. There is no place in Australian society for forced marriage or child marriage. And unless we collectively acknowledge this and agree to deal with it out in the light where everyone can see it, it will just continue to exist and fester in the shadows.